Great. Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to our last life sciences session of this year, which meets our IP update today, because we will not only be discussing particularly pharmaceuticals or life sciences in general, but we will be discussing the field of particularly pharmaceuticals in respect of trademarks. And it's, I must say, it's one of my favorite topics, so I'm actually very excited about today. Perhaps also I was very excited about today, and I still am, of course, but I must also, with some regret, inform you that Pauline Geentjes, so I would be presenting this presentation together with Pauline Geentjes, our also specialized trademark colleague, but she's ill and she won't be able to present it together with me. That's also why there's been a couple of minutes of delay in the presentation, so my apologies for that, but I need to present the entire presentation alone now. So I hope you will bear with me and that I will be sufficiently interesting and help you guide through the recent CJEU's decisions. So two decisions of the Court of Justice of the European Union, which relate to parallel trade of medicines, parallel import, parallel distribution. And the question is, what is the impact for your company? And we will, of course, if you have any questions, we will try to answer them, or I will try to answer them, still speaking in plural as a kind of custom. But ask your questions through the chat. I won't be able to see the chat while I'm presenting, but I will definitely try to answer your questions where possible at the end of the presentation. The presentation itself will probably take about 40 to 45 minutes, so that there is 10 to 15 minutes left for some questions if you want. Last remark that I also definitely wanted to add, Pauline is not here, but I have to thank her very much, and perhaps she's listening, I'm not sure, but I have to thank her very much for also preparing this presentation, which I only needed to finalize. So that's very much appreciated. Thank you, Pauline. So over to the content of the presentation. I will firstly discuss a bit of background on parallel trade in respect of medicines. For those of you who are not sufficiently aware, I will be very brief because we have a lot to discuss, which is a bit more into the depth of the discussion. So I will give some background in general on parallel trade and the relationship with trademark rights, and particularly also discuss the first BMS condition, just the general principles, and then dive into the two separate, let's say, two distinct cases that were decided by the Court of Justice of the European Union. One is on rebranding from generics to a reference medicine, and the other one is the reboxing, whether or not you can repackage into a new outer packaging in view of the unique identifier and anti-tampering device. I will finish the presentation with some takeaways if we have some time, definitely. So, free movement of goods on the one hand meets trademark rights on the other hand, and that's where the issue of parallel import comes into play. Because as you know, trademark rights, you have the right to oppose the use of the identical sign for identical products. That's the essence of your trademark. And this use, of course, includes the affixing of the sign to the goods or to the packaging thereof, or also offering the goods, putting them on the market or stocking them for those purposes under that particular sign, the trademark. Trademark exhaustion, on the other hand, you can no longer invoke a trademark right, your exclusive right, if the goods have been put on the market by you as the trademark holder or by some other company with the trademark holder's consent. You can only do so if there are legitimate reasons for the proprietor to oppose further commercialization of the goods, especially where the condition of the goods is changed or impaired after they have been put on the market. And that's, of course, where parallel import comes into play, because you need on the one hand, as a parallel importer, you buy the product in a certain member state of the European Union. You want to parallel import it into a different member state. As a result, because of the fact also that it is a medicinal product, there are some requirements. You need to change the label, amend it, and put a new label into the box in the languages that are applicable in the relevant member state. You need to change some information on the outer packaging. And as a result of that, in any event, you will, in a certain way, change or impair the goods after they have been put on the market, but it's essentially also your obligation as a parallel importer. So that is where the issue of trademarks, trademark rights come into play. So the restriction on free movement is allowed on grounds of the protection of intellectual property. As you know, there can be that restriction, as I discussed before, but for trademarks, it's limited to the specific subject matter. Repackaging always affects the specific subject matter. So you always have, in theory, the right to oppose to repackaging of your product that you have put on the market. Unless, and that's where the CJEU has rendered its, let's say, benchmark decision, the BMS, Bristol-Myers Squibb decision, where it imposed or where it set 5 cumulative BMS conditions to be fulfilled. If these conditions are fulfilled, the trademark proprietor can no longer oppose to what the parallel importer is doing with the trademark proprietor's box, with the trademark proprietor's trademark on that box. 5 conditions, in essence, opposing to repackaging, first of all, would contribute to artificial partitioning of the markets of the member states. In that case, if such opposition by the trademark holder would have this result, he cannot do it. In that case, there would be, as we call it, objective necessity for the parallel importer, because he wants to have access to that market. And that's also his right. The second to fifth condition are less important today. Secondly, the repackaging does not affect the original condition of the product in the packaging. Thirdly, the repackager and the manufacturer are identified on the repackaged product. Fourthly, no damage to the reputation of the trademark or the trademark holder. And fifthly, the parallel importer needs to send a prior notification and provide an on-demand specimen to, well, provide a specimen if it's asked for by the trademark holder to the trademark holder. That notification, of course, is necessary for the trademark holder to assess whether or not the other conditions have also been met in this particular case, or whether the parallel importer is doing something which exceeds his rights under the BMS conditions. First BMS condition, the most important one, the essential one for today. So the first BMS condition, as I said before, repackaging is allowed if reliance on the trademark by the trademark holder would, and as a result of that, the opposition to the marketing of the repackaged product would contribute to the artificial partitioning of the markets between the member state. If he would preclude the parallel importer from accessing in a certain way the market of the member state of destination. Objective necessity also means that only artificial partitioning is unlawful. Sometimes there is just some partitioning in markets which is not artificial. In other words, as I said before, there should be objective necessity for the parallel importer to repackage. That means that without repackaging, the parallel importer cannot have effective access to the market of the country of import, the country, the member state of destination. Objective necessity does not mean that a mere commercial advantage sought by the parallel importer is sufficient. If it's only about a commercial advantage, whereas the parallel importer would have access to the market otherwise, it's not objective necessity. That's also why we link this to the least infringing manner which has to be applied, the least infringing type of repackaging that has to be applied by the parallel importer. The parallel importer, to put it in, let's say, simple terms, cannot change the entire box if he can have access to the market by just putting some stickers on the box or relabeling, as we call it, the box. This is assessed at the moment of import in light of the applicable rules and the practices. There's issues of reimbursement, prescription, consumer protection. And the fact that there is objective necessity has to be proven by the parallel importer. It's not for the trademark holder to prove that there is no objective necessity. It's, of course, the burden of proof that rests on the importer. With these principles in mind, I hope that it will be, let's say, more intuitive to understand the two decisions of the CJEU in respect of rebranding on the one hand, and in respect of the impact of the anti-tampering devices and unique identifiers on the other hand. So let's look into the first discussion. This is actually a case which ended up before the Court of Justice of the European Union, referred to that court by Belgian courts. So it's a Belgian case. And the first two cases actually date back, Femara 1 and Co-Diovan 1, two Novartis products, date back to 2015. And at that point in time, there was a conclusion by the first instance court that there was objective necessity to rebrand. So what were the facts? There was, in the UK, the parallel importer would buy the generic product. You see it that on the left, in the left columns, Letrozole, Sandoz, and Femara, and Valsartan, HCTZ, Sandoz, and Co-Diovan. Sandoz, as many of you will know, is an affiliate, a subsidiary of the Novartis group. So both Co-Diovan, that was marketed by Novartis of the Novartis group, and the generic product was marketed by its generic, let's say, affiliate Sandoz. And the two products, or the four products, but the two different products, the original reference medicine, but also the generic medicine, were both repackaged, rebranded into the reference medicine, Femara, and sold as Femara on the Belgian market. Why would a parallel importer do that? Because, of course, the price of Femara, definitely depending on the market circumstances, but may be higher than the price of the generic product. So if you can repackage and rebrand into the reference medicine, the parallel importer will have an additional margin, an additional profit margin on these medicines. The question was whether he was allowed to do that or not. And at that point in time, still Commercial Court of Brussels, Dutch language commercial court, considered that that was the case. It was one of the judges, and the judge said, yes, there is objective necessity to rebrand, and it's okay to switch between generic and the innovative brand because, first of all, it's the same product. Secondly, it's the same marketing authorization. And finally, it's the same company, Sandoz Novartis. The second case is Femara 2 and Rilatin. And in this case, the generic products originated from the Dutch market and were again parallel imported into Belgium as the reference medicine. And the same question arose. This time, however, the first instance court, a different judge, concluded that there was trademark infringement by rebranding. The judge said there's, of course, no exhaustion at this point in time, and the burden of proof of artificial partitioning of the market is on the parallel importer. Why is that, and what is then the particular conclusion in this case? Well, there's no artificial partitioning. I see that there is a typo there. Since the market for the generic and the reference medicinal product are different from a perspective of regulation and medical practice. So, in other words, the parallel importer had, with the generic product, access to the generic Belgian market, which is different from the reference, the market of the reference product. In other words, as I said before, it's no artificial partitioning, it's just partitioning that follows from the regulation and the medical practice, but it's not artificial partitioning created by the opposition of the trademark holder. The goal, as the court concluded, is for the parallel importer merely commercial, and as a result of that, there is no objective necessity. This case went to the Brussels Court of Appeal, and the Brussels Court of Appeal asked a preliminary question to the Court of Justice. And the preliminary question is as follows. Is it possible, or can the trademark holder oppose to the rebranding of the generic medicine into the branded medicine if that trademark holder is economically linked to the trademark holder of the generic medicine? So if Novartis in this particular case is economically linked to Sandoz, can he oppose, or is there in such case artificial partitioning of the markets? And the CJEU's decision is pretty clear in my view, I would say. I'm no doubt that there will again be discussion. It's a field that always leads to discussion because it's also a field that has quite an impact on both the interests of the innovative industry, of the reference medicines, and the industry of the parallel importers. But in my view, I would say that the decision is quite clear of the Court of Justice. And it starts with the general idea: the trademark proprietors of the reference medicines, and also actually of the generic medicine, may in principle oppose to the rebranding of the parallel imported generic medicine to the reference medicine. So yes, he can oppose to rebranding, unless there are two cumulative conditions complied with. Firstly, if the two medicines, the generic and the reference medicine, are identical in all respects, then rebranding could be possible if, secondly, that rebranding meets the BMS conditions, and particularly the first condition of objective necessity. On the first condition, identical in all respects, what does that mean? The Court of Justice says a generic is not necessarily in all cases identical. It's not because it's bioequivalent, because as you know, generics are by law required to be bioequivalent to their identical and are considered to be bioequivalent to the reference medicine, I mean. Being bioequivalent is not the same as being identical. Why? Well, two reasons. First of all, there can be potential differences, as the CJEU states, in terms of composition. And that composition or these differences may relate to the pharmaceutical form, may relate to the chemical form and of the active substance, and or may relate to the excipients used in the final medicine. They can be different. So it doesn't mean that because they will have the same bioequivalence, that they will have the same mode of action and work in the same manner for the patient, that they are entirely identical. Secondly, some drugs are also contraindicated to be replaced during treatment, which also can apply to, for instance, changing from the generic or the reference medicinal product to the generic, or the other way around. So if one would conclude that, and that's the Court of Justice saying this, if one would conclude that rebranding from a generic to a reference medicine is always possible because they are bioequivalent and therefore also identical, he would actually mislead or could mislead professional health care, so HCPs, healthcare professionals, and patients, and this could potentially have serious consequences for the health of those patients. So only if it is identical in all respects, you can fulfill, or the first condition of identity can be complied with. And what does that mean, being identical in all respects? Well, if it's manufactured by the same entity, for instance, the same exact entity, the same company, or by economically linked entities, which I would say is probably this, well, this would of course apply to Sandoz on the one hand presently, and on the other hand, Novartis, which are at least economically linked entities. So in that case, there could be identity, but Again, this is not in view or to the view of the CJEU sufficient. It also needs to constitute, and that's the words of the CJEU, an actual fact, one and the same product under two different sets of rules. So two different sets of rules, generic, reference medicine. But if they are in essence, in actual fact, one and the same product, so going back to this slide, if there's no difference in the pharmaceutical form, not in the chemical form of the active substance, not in the excipients, and it's also being placed on the market by the same entity or economically linked entities. In other words, it's just the same product put or being marketed on under a different trademark and in respect of different rules, generics, reference medicines. In such case, the first requirement would be fulfilled. There is identity between the products. But it's not sufficient that there is identity. Remember when I said here, unless there are two cumulative conditions met, it needs to be identical on the one hand, and it needs to meet the BMS conditions. The BMS conditions of objective necessity. Here again, the CJEU says objective necessity, and it's just repeating its earlier case law. There is objective necessity if the medicine, the generic medicine, cannot be marketed in the member state of destination under its trademark of origin. So in other words, if letrozole Sandoz cannot be marketed in Belgium as letrozole Sandoz. There is no objective necessity if the generic medicine can be marketed in the member state of destination under that trademark of origin. If you can market letrozole Sandoz as letrozole Sandoz in Belgium, there's no objective necessity to market it as Femara. So in such case, there is no artificial partitioning of the markets of the member states. And even, and this was quite interesting that the CJEU also addressed this, even if there is a reference medicine in the member states of in the member state of destination, but no corresponding generic, so meaning letrozole Sandoz is not marketed in Belgium. For instance, it could be Femara and letrozole Mylan, but not letrozole Sandoz. Then the question, of course, arises, does the parallel importer in that case is he objectively necessary to rebrand to Femara to have access to the Belgian market? And the Court of Justice said no, and it referred to what the Advocate General already stated on this point. The member states of destination cannot refuse parallel import for a generic if there is a reference medicinal product on the market. If Femara is on the market in Belgium, the Belgian Federal Drugs Agency, the FAJG, cannot refuse the parallel import of letrozole Sandoz into Belgium, unless for considerations relating to protection of health and life of humans. So in that case, according to the court, there's still no objective necessity, and this is important in my view. The final point that the Court of Justice adds, but I think it ties in with the first 2 points I just referred to, is that the mere pursuit of economic advantage is, as you know, not sufficient, and that this particular case, if you can market letrozole Sandoz in Belgium as letrozole Sandoz, it is actually only about pursuing an economic advantage. It's about trying to use the reputation of the trademark of the reference medicine, because patients know this reference medicine for a longer time already. It has a reputation on the market, much more, definitely at the start, of generic entry than the generic medicine. And secondly, it's also trying to use, like I discussed at the start of the presentation, trying to use or make use of the more profitable category of reference medicines, whereas you're just buying and selling the generic medicine. So forward looking, what would the Brussels Court of Appeal decide? That's of course difficult to say at this point in time. It still needs to be decided now by the Court of Appeal in view of what the CJEU has held. And I would say cautiously, is it identical in all respects? Perhaps. One would have to compare the composition, I think, of the generic Sandoz products with the reference products of Novartis. But secondly, are the BMS conditions the condition of objective necessity? Would it be fulfilled? In my view, that's unlikely, because of course the product is on the market, right? I mean, you would have to look at the situation on the market when the parallel import was occurring, and at that point in time, to my understanding, both products were even on the market. But even if it would have been only Femara and Relatin that would have been on the market, according to the Court of Justice, you could still import the generic version into Belgium. Of course, notwithstanding any other IP rights that may at that point in time have been applicable, for instance, patent rights. Second case, reboxing in view of the unique identifier and the ATD. Some background, I think, is perhaps necessary on the unique identifier and ATD. This stems from the Falsified Medicines Directive, and the Falsified Medicines Directive back in 2019 introduced the obligation for medicinal products to have two mandatory safety features. The one is a unique identifier, the other one is an anti-tampering device. What is a unique identifier? Well, it allows you to verify the authenticity of the product and to identify the individual packs, the barcode, as printed on the box, for instance. The anti-tampering device is a device which is placed on the box, on, let's say, the closure of the box, and which allows to verify whether or not that outer packaging has been opened or not. For instance, it could be a seal, it could be something else, it could be something, let's say, more strong than just a seal also. But it allows you or anyone to see, well, has this product been opened or not before me as a patient start using it. And these principles apply to prescription medicines, and not only to the original manufacturers, no, also the parallel traders need to do this. In other words, they need to put a new unique identifier and a new ATD on the products that they will market and parallel import. The question is, of course, what is the impact on parallel trade? Does it lead to a free pass for reboxing the outer packaging? Because on the one hand, or let's say for two reasons, parallel importers argued, yes, we need to rebox. We don't have any other option. First reason is, if we open that original box, we break the anti-tampering device. And so the original box can no longer be used because anyone would see that this has been opened and thus been tampered with. And that is, of course, something that, well, the patient, that wouldn't work. The patient would be concerned about the fact that it had been opened before. Secondly, the barcode containing the unique identifier is precluded from being affixed to the outer packaging by an adhesive label. And there was some basis or some reference to the delegated regulation. The fact that it needed to be printed on the box was one of the arguments. There were some arguments nonetheless to say, no, it's not because there's now in the the Falsified Medicines Directive and the unique identifier and ATD obligation that you could, in all cases, because all these prescription medicines, for all these prescription medicines that are parallel imported, you can now use new boxes. There's under no circumstances still the possibility to relabel that box. What were the counter arguments? First of all, the FMD already stated this is without prejudice to the provisions concerning intellectual property rights. Secondly, Article 74A of the Community Code also stated that safety features may be covered. And there was also the reference in Article 47A to the replacing of the safety features with equivalent safety features. And then in question 20 of the Commission's Q&A, there was actually the question, can a lawfully opened pack be resealed? So can the parallel importer who lawfully opens a pack, can he reseal it? Can he put a new anti-tampering device on top of the older one or whatever, but just use the outer box and reseal it again? And the Commission said yes. Yes is the most important thing here for the question of objective necessity and reboxing. And it added some requirements if the old ATD is replaced with an equivalent ATD, which means that the new ATD must completely seal the pack and cover any visible sign of the original broken ATD. The Swedish court looked into this question. It's one of the courts that we're aware of and said, no, there is no reboxing, no objective necessity to rebox in view of these requirements, because what I just said, recital 29, article 74A of the community code, and the fact that the delegated regulation cannot significantly amend the community code because it's only a delegated regulation. The fact that there was some testimony of a pharmacy employee testifying problems with relabeling, or the fact that the Swedish Drugs Agency considered reboxing necessary to comply with the FMD was, according to the court, not sufficient, and the IP right holder could still object. Some other courts, the Landgericht of Hamburg and then the court in Denmark, referred some preliminary questions to the Court of Justice, which I've put on this slide. But I will move to the next slide because the first three questions in the first case were, let's say, rephrased by the Court of Justice in: is a trademark proprietor entitled to oppose to reboxing, where the replacement of the ATD of the original packaging, so the ATD of the original manufacturer of the original box, would leave visible traces of opening on that original packaging? So what is the precise question? I'll rephrase again. Can the trademark holder oppose to reboxing if the parallel importer, after opening that original box, leaves and replace it with its own ATD, leaves visible traces of opening on that original packaging? Or in other words, do these visible traces lead to objective necessity to rebox? The answer of the Court of Justice, pretty similar to what I've discussed in respect of rebranding. The first sentence is still: trademark proprietors may in principle oppose to, in this case, the reboxing of medicines by parallel importers. And it added, even when such reboxing has been carried out in compliance with the FMD. In other words, the FMD does not affect the trademark holder's rights to oppose to reboxing. That also applies if the use of the original packaging and replacing of the original safety features would leave visible or tangible traces. So also if there's visible or tangible traces, trademark holders may still oppose to reboxing. Two conditions. If two conditions are fulfilled, then the parallel importer would, I think, so if two conditions are fulfilled, the parallel importer can rebox into a new product. If the wholesalers, pharmacists, prescribers, and so forth are not able to determine with certainty that the traces of opening are attributable to the parallel importer, so if they're not able to see whether or not is this lawful tampering, then of course they can rebox. It may be necessary to avoid any confusion at a later stage. I think this would be quite exceptional from a factual perspective. More important is probably the second criterion: if the traces would cause such strong resistance from a significant proportion of consumers that it would constitute a barrier to effective access to the market. So if it would, again, lead to artificial partitioning of the markets. More concretely, if it's clear, and there needs to be proof in concreto, not a general presumption of consumer resistance, but if it's clear on the basis of proof that various, let's say, patients look at the product and see what has been left in terms of visible or tangible trace, and would think this is not a product I can buy because I'm just concerned with the origin, and I'm concerned that it's still actually a good product, a product that functions, the original product. In that case, you could say that there is, or it would lead to objective necessity. Put it in practice, this particular question, I think there are some ATDs, if you open the box is just completely destroyed. you tear out some carton, and after that you take out the pills, or you take out the medicinal product that is in the box. In that case, I think you can say that a consumer would be quite opposed. You need still to prove it in concreto, but you could say that the consumer would be quite opposed to then that box being stickered together and lined together in a way that is just too obvious and creates some concerns with safety and origin. On the other hand, if it's just about a label that is affixed on the outer flap, one of the flaps, or the two flaps, of course, and the one flap has been opened, the label, it leaves a slight visible trace, but then you put another label on top or next to it, I think you could say that there wouldn't be many consumers, let's say, have resistance against that product and buying that product and using that product. So it's kind of example, of course, and courts will still need to look into it more concretely, but I think that is a bit the gist of this particular condition. The second question that the CJEU needed to answer is equally interesting and related to the unique identifier. So not to the ATD, but the unique identifier. And it's the concern or the argument that I have referred to before. Must that unique identifier be printed directly on the packaging, or is an external sticker with a new barcode, a new unique identifier, is that sufficient? You just put a sticker over the old barcode and the new barcode on that new sticker. Wouldn't that work as well? And so Article 5.3 of the delegated regulation stated, as I said before, that manufacturers shall print the barcode on the packaging on a smooth, uniform, low reflecting surface. So printing is not the same as placing it on top. That was the argument. But here again, as I said before, Article 74A 1B refers to, of the Falsified Medicines Directive, refers to replacing the unique identifier by an equivalent device. So how could you, let's say, replace it if it's not about if relabeling would be precluded in sort of way? And secondly, Article 17 of the delegated regulation also referred to placing instead of printing an equivalent unique identifier. And so the court said this shows that you can place, you can relabel, you can place your unique identifier as a parallel importer on top of the old one, and there's no, let's say, obligation to print it on a unique, new outer box and thus to rebox. A sticker, in other words, that's a conclusion, is sufficient. Well, it's not a conclusion, it's the sticker is sufficient, that is the conclusion, but you still need to take into account some conditions. First of all, the sticker cannot be removed without being damaged. That is something different, according to the court, than the fact that the label would leave traces when removed. If somebody would remove it and there would be some traces on the original box for whatever reason, that as such is not the same as the sticker itself being damaged. The court wanted to clarify this. Secondly, the barcode needs to remain perfectly readable, and that's of course logical because you still need to use the unique identifier in the manner as it is intended to be used. You still need to scan it, of course. So that needs to be and remain perfectly readable throughout the supply chain and also throughout the period that is referred to in Article 6 of the delegated regulation. I think it's important here also to note that, in my view, a parallel importer cannot use this as an excuse. He cannot say, oh, but if I mean, for instance, the paper of my relabel is so thin that it would be immediately damaged, the sticker, if somebody would remove it. So as a result, I will need to rebox. The parallel importer can, of course, not use and hide behind these obligations to then say, well, reboxing is objectively necessary. I think it's rather the other way around. It is objectively not necessary to rebox unless, of course, the particular conditions would be applied with or complied with. And because of the fact, or when he would place a label on the outer packaging, in that case, he should also take care and ensure that these conditions are fulfilled, because these are actually his obligations under the regulation. well, under the directive and the delegated regulation. Last question then, how do you cope? Let's put it that way. How do you cope with a member state providing some restrictions, or for instance, asking parallel importers to rebox rather than repackage? How do you cope with member states, for instance, the federal drugs agencies, setting guidelines, and that's happened, guidelines which say we prefer repackaging and relabeling is only allowed exceptionally? And the Court of Justice answered this clearly. It said whether or not this preference would have been disclosed by the member states or their drug agencies or the health authorities, that as such does not affect the trademark holder's right to oppose. So you as a trademark holder still remains to oppose. And I would actually also add, the Court of Justice has clearly stated that such guidelines would not be in line with the federal, the Falsified Medicines Directive, read together with trademark law. So it's not required under the Falsified Medicines Directive to repackage. You can also relabel, and trademark holders' rights cannot be affected under the Falsified Medicines Directive. So if member states would still impose these types of restrictions, it would probably not meet the EU law or not be in compliance with EU law, and you as a trademark holder do not need to take this into account or feel restricted by it. I think so. It's 2:45, so we have some time limited. But if we, so here also last point, of course, rebranding from generic to, this is a typo, but reboxing in view of the unique identifier and ATD. If we, let's say, look a bit forward, what could happen in these regards, I think it's perhaps a bit more complex, and you need to take into account a lot of factual circumstances, much more complex than rebranding. Why is it more complex? Because, for instance, it depends on your unique, your ATD. Like I said before, is it a sticker, a mere sticker, or is it a tear-away closure? These types of things will impact whether or not there's a possibility to just relabel. And you need, as a parallel importer, then you'd still need to provide proof of resistance from consumers. So again, that's also pretty factual and also depends on the circumstances. Same, I think, I would say, for let's say the general assessment then in view of the ATD. If we look to the unique identifier and the member states, I think the conclusion would probably be, if there would be such member states restrictions, that they would not meet or not comply with EU law, in my view, and in any event cannot prevent you from enforcing your trademark rights. And also the unique identifier, I would say the fact that it needs to be printed or that there's a reference to printed does not prevent relabeling in view of other provisions in the regulations. So it's more about whether or not this ATD will prevent actual reboxing, relabeling, and would require you to rebox in view of the factual circumstances. I hope that was a bit clear. So the takeaways, I think I've already discussed most of the takeaways. As I said before, proprietors of trademarks remain in principle entitled to oppose to the rebranding or the repackaging of the parallel imported medicines in both cases. Then if we look at rebranding, as I said before, there needs to be and identity and objective necessity before you can actually rebrand. Identity, I think, will be particularly important if it's marketed by economically linked entities and or the same entity. The fact that it's bioequivalent is not important, but if it's marketed by these entities and if it's in actual fact constitutes the same product, so the same composition, you could say that it's identical. But even in that case, rebranding can only be necessary even from the one identical product to the other identical reference product if the medicine concerned, the generic medicine, probably cannot be marketed in the member state of destination under that trademark of the generic medicine. Reboxing, as I discussed before, The visible or tangible traces do not amount to objective necessity to rebox. It's not, let's say, free pass to rebox. There's only objective necessity if these visible or tangible traces cause strong resistance from a significant proportion of the consumers, and that would require proof in concreto based on the circumstances of the products, the market, the traces that are visible. Are they visible from the start, or can they only be affected after thorough verification? That's what I said, the difference between tearaway closure, ripping the entire box apart, or just a sticker which you can carefully open. And the sticker with the unique identifier is that is sufficient if it cannot be removed without being damaged, and if the barcode remains perfectly readable throughout the supply chain and throughout the relevant period. Which leaves me to thank you for attending our, let's say, Christmas edition of the Life Sciences session and IP update. I will also look into the chat whether or not there are questions, and also, of course, again, to thank Pauline for her contribution to this presentation. She's not here with us, but then she's in any event here with us in spirit, I would say, and with many thanks and gratitude. I'll look into the questions and I'll come back to you in, let's say, 1 or 2 minutes if there would have been questions. Thank you. I cannot unmute myself. I think it works now, right? Okay, perfect. So apparently so I'm going to close this because apparently my Teams is telling me I'm still muted, which I'm apparently not. Okay, so I'm not sure what you've heard because my computer was telling me I was still muted when I was apparently not. So I'm not sure whether you've heard me before, but there have been some questions and I will be happy to address them. I think the first question which we received is whether the judgment implies that PIs cannot repack into a new outer carton and shall go back to pasting stickers. How do we interpret these judgments in light of and in relation to the requirements of the FMD implementation? Are they forced parallel importers to completely repack as they could not otherwise reseal the packs in a proper way? Is that still the case? Has this been contradicted? I think I've discussed this beforehand also during the presentation. The fact that there is a unique identifier and it needs to be placed on the device, on the product, not on the device, but on the product, on the outer packaging, that as such is not sufficient to say that you now need a new carton. I can very well imagine that it leads to some practical issues which a parallel importer would be confronted with, because he needs to have then labels which you can re-sticker on the original box with a new unique identifier. Same for the ATD, although whether or not you put the ATD on a new box or an old box, perhaps that's less, the impact is less substantial. But according to the CJEU, it's not sufficient that there are these practical issues. Your unique identifier does not prevent you from putting a unique identifier on a sticker and then applying that sticker on your original box or on the original box of the manufacturer. Does the CJEU decision mean that where reference medicinal products and generic medicinal products are not manufactured by the same entity, they are unlikely to be considered to be identical? Yes, that would be my understanding. The CJEU refers to the two conditions linked, put on the market by linked economical entities or same entity, and then also having to be identical in all respects. So putting it the other way around, if it's only similar or identical even in terms of composition, but not linked by the same entities, there is definitely an argument to be made that there's no identity of the products. And thus you do not need to look into objective necessity. So in my view, the CJEU actually limits substantially the possibilities of rebranding, because first of all, you would need economically linked or the same entity, economically linked entities or the same entity. Secondly, it needs to be actually identical, in fact, the one product to the other. And thirdly, you still need objective necessity to enter the market of destination. The condition identical on all aspects, would this also include the printing on the capsules? Often generic has different or no printing compared to the original, or is this too small difference? It could give confusion, difficulties for identification of the products for patients or HCPs. So here I think the question, if I'm understanding correctly, it's even if there would be, let's say you would meet, it would be the same composition. If there would be differences in printing on the capsules, for instance, to the original, what would that lead to the fact that the products are not identical? I think you would probably need to assess this on a factual basis, and of course the court will need to look into this, but my personal view, and that's of course why this seminar and this webinar, why we have it, is try to answer these questions. My personal view would be that it may be too limited, because the court really refers to the composition of the products and the excipients, the pharmaceutical form, or the chemical form of the active substance. Even if, and I understand that it could give confusion or difficulties for identification for patients or HCP. So I wouldn't exclude running it. I wouldn't exclude a court also agreeing with it, because of course the Court of Justice refers to always examples. The question will really be, is there a difference in identity? For the first CJEU decision, what if two economically linked companies, generic company and originator company, each use a different manufacturing process? Would that still be, in fact, one and the same product? Here, I think, personally, the question will be, what is the impact of the manufacturing process on the eventual product? But I think it comes more closely, perhaps, to not being identical products. Because if it's economically linked entities, same entity definitely also, manufacturing processes and final composition are often the same. But if you could say that the manufacturing process, the difference in the manufacturing process leads to a difference also in the eventual product, which is relevant, I think you can rely on the fact that they are manufactured differently. For instance, you could have manufacturing processes which are protected by patent rights even, which lead to, and so the generic, for instance, well, if it's an economically linked entity, it can be different, but of course, if the generic cannot use the manufacturing process or uses a different process, there will always be the question of what is the impact of that manufacturing process on the eventual product. And so you need to assess whether or not it's identical. I think that it gives you definitely an argument, a first argument, and then you will still need to verify what is the actual impact. If the different marketing process is just insignificant, the difference in the manufacturing, then I think you would have or reach a different conclusion and say that they are actually identical products. It's not as such, I think, sufficient, but it can definitely lead to sufficient differences. Does the ability to parallel import where no generic is approved in the importing state not undermine the requirements on generic approval in the importing country? Well, yes, but of course we're talking about parallel import here in this regard. So it's about parallel importing a generic. It's not about authorizing a generic as such. Also, a parallel importer still needs to obtain approval for the parallel import of his or her product, and then all the conditions need to be assessed and they need to be fulfilled with. But I think there is definitely the possibility for the regulatory conditions to be fulfilled with if there is a reference medicine on the market, and that's also what the Advocate General says, and that's also what the CJEU says. And as a result of that, you can get a parallel import generic version of a reference medicinal product on the market of destination, even if the actual generic version is not authorized. That doesn't, of course, mean that in that case, also the generic, let's say letrozole Sandoz, which is not authorized, but the parallel import version of letrozole Sandoz by one parallel importer X, that is authorized, doesn't mean that Sandoz can all of a sudden start commercializing or putting its product on the Belgian market as letrozole Sandoz. It still needs to apply and comply with its requirements for obtaining marketing approval. Does the judgment on reboxing now means that generally PI parallel import should as a basis over sticker, parallel importer should as a basis over sticker or relabel, and repacking into a new carton is more of an exception? Yes, I would definitely think that is the conclusion of the second case. I think you can't continue to say that this parallel import product needs to be reboxed just because of the fact that there are unique identifiers and ATDs. As I said before, I think you really need to look into the actual facts and need to compare the products with one another, need to compare in this case whether or not you can open the ATD of the original carton without or the original box without completely destroying that box. If it's just about a sticker, I wouldn't see why you could still rebox in view of the CJEU's decision. Did any authority issue guidance as a result of the judgments, for instance, in relation to member states' preference for repacking as opposed to relabeling? So first of all, the decisions date back to, I think, the 17th of November. That's 1 month. Speaking from a Belgian perspective, of course, but guidance that would have been issued in view of the CJEU decisions within 1 month, that would be extremely quick. I'm not excluding that there could be in other countries, but I'm pretty certain that the Federal Medicines Agency in Belgium has not issued guidance on the basis or in view of the CJEU decisions. Apologies if I would have missed something. If that would be the case in any event, I'll let you know in our thank you email for attending this webinar. On the decisions about rebranding generics, do you think that the market share in the importing country could serve as a basis to assess the objective necessity to effectively access the market? My view, and it's the last question, by the way, my view would be no. Because the fact that the market of the generics in the new in the member state of destination would be limited, let's say, for instance, even 2% or 5%, whereas the reference medicine would have 95%, I think that doesn't lead to objective necessity. Why? Objective necessity to rebrand in this particular case. Why? Because the Court of Justice actually says that even if there would have been no authorization for the generic medicine, hence the market share of the generic medicine would be 0, it would also not lead to objective necessity to rebrand. So I think, in conclusion, and I think that's perhaps the most important conclusion from my perspective, I think both the possibilities of rebranding and the possibility of reboxing, free pass to rebox in view of the unique identifier and ATD have been substantially limited by the CJEU. I think also the most important thing now, and that's what we advise our clients, and feel free to reach out if you want us to do the same for you. But what we advise to our clients is to reassess the correspondence that has been sent, let's say in the last 1 or 2 years in this regard, because there's been a lot of discussions. In most letters, we would personally, we would advise our clients to either, well, take action, because I've always had the view that this was actually the proper interpretation of both the FMD and both also on rebranding, or to at least reserve all rights and get back to them after the CJEU has rendered its decision. In this case, the CJEU has rendered its decision. It's, in my view, pretty clear on both accounts. So if you feel that a product is impacted and one of your products that is being parallel imported, I think it's probably necessary to revise these files and send a follow-up letter asking to switch to relabeling in cases where they have been reboxing, or ask to stop rebranding and just use the generic versions in cases where they have been rebranding. So the last comment I've seen coming in was thank you and enjoy the festivities, and I think the same goes from my side to you. Thank you again for being here, enjoy the festivities, and see you next year at our next Life Sciences session. Bye-bye.